power of evolutionary thinking, I would say, but even more a testimony to the power of the process of evolutionary development. And you might think that that reduces human cognition to something sterile and mechanistic, because many of the proponents of the notion of natural selection have adopted a fairly reductive materialism to account for the process of natural selection. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight too, I hope, if I can manage to tie all these things together. So, no perception without embodiment. That's pretty interesting, that. And so I'll tell you a little side neuropsychological story. So, you know, we tend to think that when we see the world, well, there the world is, and then we see the world, and we see the objects, and there the objects are, but that isn't how it works, and I've tried to explain why, because there's an infinite number of ways of perceiving even the simplest of visual scenes. And then there's auditory scenes, and then there's the problem of smell, and there's the problem of touch. I mean, these are hard problems, which is why it took, 3 billion years to solve them. There's a condition called utilization behavior. It's got an interesting neuropsychological condition. And generally, if it has affected right-handed people, that's relevant here because of lateralization. If you have left prefrontal damage, you sometimes will engage in utilization behavior. And what happens if you're afflicted by this neuropsychological condition is that you lose the ability to inhibit your motor response to the presentation of an object. Now, that's worth thinking about, even though it doesn't sound like it's something that's necessarily worth thinking about, because what do you mean motor response to an object? Because we think object, thought, motor response, but that's not how it works. The object itself announces its utility in the perception. And so what that means is that your eyes, which map, let's say, patterns of arrays, that's a good way of thinking about it. They map that onto your visual system, but part of your visual system is actually your motor output system. And so that when I look at, let's say, this bottle, I think bottle, hand, grip, drink. But seeing bottle is hand grip, and hand grip is drink. And so if you have a utilization behavior, you lose the ability to inhibit the motor response to the object. And so if you had this condition, I put a cup in front of you, you would pick it up and drink from it. And if you walk down a hallway and there's a door open, you will go through the door. And it's not because you see the object door and think door and then think walk through and then walk through, even though that's what you think. It's that door is a walk-through place. And if you lack inhibition, you can't stop acting out the perception. And so what that implies is that at some direct level, and this is the science, not the philosophy, you don't see objects and infer meaning. You see meaning and infer objects. And that's really something. You can think about that for like 40 years, because it looks like it's true factually. And that's a strange thing too, right? It's a very strange claim to say that the facts support the notion that the primary object of perception is meaning, not objects. And I actually think that's an interpretation, though I won't go into that tonight, that's more in keeping with evolutionary logic than the idea that you perceive objects and infer meaning. And so the stripping away of meaning metaphysically from the world of apperception that's a consequence of scientism is actually predicated on something approximating bad science. And that's become increasingly evident, I would say, in the neurophysiology of perception. And that's an important field, given that the problem of perception is the problem that has bedeviled both the sciences and the humanities, and also engineering, for that matter, for the last 50 years. And it has not only done that, it's produced this riveting of culture that's occurred within the universities, partly because of the postmodernist claim. And so, fundamental postmodernist claims. Now, the first claim is that there's no canonical interpretation that's self-evident. It's like, okay, fair enough. That might be a claim emerging from literary departments, English literary departments, under the influence of French continental thought, let's say. I don't think you can take issue with that. I think it happens to be the case, because the notion that there is a multiplicity of potentially valid interpretations is true. What isn't true is the idea that we use power and domination to solve that problem primarily. And there's no excuse, philosophically, from leaping from a mystery that's utterly profound, which is the problem of perception, to the conclusion that some pathological, socially constructed process is therefore at the basis of the act of perception and categorization itself. I think it's unforgivable cognitively, and it's cynical beyond belief, and it's corrosive beyond our capacity to deal with it. I mean, you think about what that claim means, is that the way you solve the, and that's like an implicit bias argument, by the way, just to make that clear as well, that you solve the problem of categorization by imposing your will to power on the world in some zero-sum, winner-take-all game of dominion and oppression. It's like you could not, if you tried, you could not come up with a more cynical view of the mechanism that makes order, habitable order out of chaos. But what's sort of delightful about that, in some sense, is that it's just not true. It's literally. We could say scientifically, if we take scientifically to mean literally, we can say it's not true. It actually turns out that even in the animal kingdom, you know, you might think the hierarchies that we use to orient ourselves in, that's part of the strategy that we use to guarantee our survival. You know, we fight tooth and nail with nature red and claw to climb the hierarchies of dominance as a consequence of our will to power. It's like, no, actually, that isn't how it works. And so we all have this image, or many of us, I would say, have an image of chimpanzee troops, let's say, our closest primate relative. We split from them in evolutionary terms about 7 million years ago, something like that. You can calculate that quite accurately by looking at the mutation rate of genetic material that we share with chimps, and calculate the average mutation rate and look at the propagation of mutations and the separation of them. You can get a pretty accurate estimate of the split.